You might know Jen Hatmaker. She was a New York Times bestselling author, an HGTV star, a really beloved figure in the evangelical world. And from the outside, her life looked, well, perfect. But her new memoir, Awake, tells the incredible story of how that entire world shattered in a single moment. And it all started with just 5 whispered words.
This right here, this is the moment that detonated her life. Those words, they weren't for her. Her husband of 26 years, a pastor, was lying right next to her in bed, voice texting his girlfriend. It was a discovery that didn't just crack her marriage, it blew it to pieces.
But see, this was so much more than just the end of a relationship. This was the collapse of her entire identity. Everything she had built, her career, her family, her faith, her very understanding of who she was all tied to a life that was suddenly, brutally revealed to be a lie. It wasn't just about losing a husband. It was about losing herself.
So to really get how she rebuilt everything, we first have to look at the pieces of that shattered life. This wasn't just a marriage ending. This was about the complete and total breakdown of the beliefs that had shaped her entire world, starting with the culture she grew up in.
The messaging she absorbed her whole life was just built on a foundation of shame. For girls, it was the classic Dead a Rose sermon. You're this perfect gift for your future husband, and with every physical step you take, you lose a petal, becoming a ruined stick. And for boys, it was public humiliation over pornography, often before they even knew what it was, branding them as dirty and filthy, and their natural curiosity as gross. So the core teaching was really simple. Do not trust yourself. She was explicitly taught to outsource all authority, to see her own instincts and desires not as a guide, but as a huge, dangerous red flag, something you had to ignore and push down.
You know, this lifelong training and basically abandoning yourself, it created the perfect storm for codependency. And in therapy, Hatmaker had to face a really tough truth about how this dynamic wasn't just something that happened to her, but a pattern she was actively a part of.
And this was the big realization for her. She wasn't just a passive victim. She was an active manager of the dysfunction, constantly trying to soften blows, making excuses for other people, and desperately trying to control how things looked and felt. She even used pulling away emotionally as a form of control. It was a toxic pattern she had to own before she could ever hope to break it.
So, after the shattering, there has to be a shift, right? Faced with the complete failure of all the external systems she'd been taught to trust, she had to find a new source of authority, and this led to the most critical turning point in her whole journey.
Her mind was just gone. It was stuck in this poisonous, horrible loop, replaying the trauma over and over again. It was a totally unreliable place to be. So, for the very first time in her life, she decided to turn inward, to the one part of herself she had always been taught to ignore, her body.
But hang on a second. Think about that. If you've spent your entire life being told your body is untrustworthy, that its feelings are basically lies, how do you suddenly decide to make it your North Star? I mean, where would you even begin?
Well, it turns out her body had never lied to her. She tells this story about her 8th grade teacher, Mr. Berman, a guy everyone loved who's secretly grooming female students. Long before her brain could even compute the danger, her body was reacting. She'd feel this unfamiliar prickle. Her hands would tingle with nervousness. She'd feel sick to her stomach around him. Her body knew the truth, even when her mind didn't. It had always been her most reliable narrator.
Okay, so trusting her body wasn't just some internal, abstract idea. It led to these really tangible, symbolic acts of rebuilding her life, literally from the ground up, both physically and spiritually. About a year into this whole crisis, after carrying the immense weight of her family's trauma, her body finally sent a signal she just couldn't ignore. She ended up in a clinic with a blood pressure of 175/125. I mean, that's dangerously high. It was a physical manifestation of a year of nonstop adrenaline and grief. This was her moment of surrender. A really kind doctor basically gave her permission to stop white-knuckling her way through all the pain. She finally accepted help, antidepressants, blood pressure medication, and began the real work of caring for the body that had so faithfully carried her through the absolute worst.
And from that point on, the rebuilding became something you could actually see. Her friends rebuilt the front porch her ex had torn up and just left in a hole, a literal broken home made whole and beautiful again. She bought a vintage Bronco, a cool car with moxie that was all hers, and she built this massive 28-seat table in her backyard, a defiant proclamation that her life was going to be full again.
So this whole journey of shattering, turning, and then rebuilding, it all leads to this new way of being. It's a reclamation of herself that brings the entire story full circle in a really powerful way. Remember how this whole thing started? Waking up at 2:30 a.m. to those 5 whispered words? For months, that time of night was a source of absolute terror for her, a recurring nightmare. But through her healing, she managed to transform that memory. So there she is, lying in bed one night, awake at that exact same time, and she feels a new message rise up from deep inside her. Her own body, her truest self, spoke the very words of betrayal back to her, but this time it was a promise of loyalty. I just can't quit you.
And that's the ultimate lesson, right? She had become her own safe harbor. After a whole life spent outsourcing her security to other people, to institutions, to a partner, she finally discovered that the most reliable, trustworthy person in her life was, and had always been, herself.
And that leaves us with a pretty powerful question for ourselves. Hatmaker's story is one of a catastrophic wake-up call, one that forced her to become the authority in her own life. It makes you wonder, right? What systems or stories or beliefs might be keeping us asleep? And what would it really take for us to finally wake up?